Okay, great. So it's 7 p.m. So I guess we'll get started. My name is Paul Ligety. Hello, everyone. And I'm the Vice President of the Historical Society of West Windsor, a nonprofit that's been around since 1983 to preserve and promote our town's history. So it's wonderful to see everyone here. And hopefully you're all here for the lecture. We are still here, covering tribal history, culture, sovereignty challenges, and misconceptions of the Nanticoke-Lenni-Lenape. Our guest speaker tonight is Reverend Dr. John R. Norwood, a pastor of Ujima Village Christian Church and former Nanticoke-Lenni-Lenape tribal councilman and judge. A big thank you to him for being here. So to just put this into context, West Windsor, like the rest of New Jersey and several surrounding states, was once solely home to an indigenous society known as the Lenni-Lenape, who had lived here for thousands of years prior to colonial settlement. They were composed of multiple distinct tribes, and the one in the West Windsor area specifically was called either the Assanpinks or Santikans. You may recognize their legacy in the naming of the Assanpink Creek, which runs through the southern portion of West Windsor, and the Historical Society has a lot more information about them if anyone's interested. Now, I'm not going to go specifically into their history because that's not what tonight's lecture is for. But I will mention that following colonial settlement of New Jersey in the 1600s, and over the course of generations, the majority of the Lenni-Lenape were pressured and driven out of the state. So one question that we frequently get based on that statement is whether any indigenous residents still live in New Jersey, and the answer is a resounding yes. In fact, there are a few tribes that still exist here, such as the Nanticoke-Lenni-Lenape in southern New Jersey, and this is what we will be exploring tonight. While they are not the same tribe that inhabited the West Windsor area specifically, there are a lot of historical and cultural overlaps, and as New Jersey residents, it's obviously important for us and contingent upon us to recognize and learn about the history, culture, and current dynamics of the Lenape. So before we get into the lecture, I'd like to give some context about where this fits in with the Historical Society's yearly calendar. So in 1797, and I'm sure many of you who've been to the previous lectures have heard this already, but in 1797, West Windsor was formed, meaning that this year the town turns 225 years old. So tonight's presentation is just one of a few dozen events the Historical Society of West Windsor is overseeing to commemorate this anniversary. And we are working with a variety of different local organizations, as well as the municipal government throughout the year to oversee events such as historic panels, reenactments, history tours, and much more. We also have a variety of ongoing projects in the work, such as permanent educational signage in historic communities, art installations, and even a West Windsor history book. And so you can visit the link at the bottom of the screen here to learn much more about this and how to provide support and get involved. And later this month, actually, later in April, we will start having historic walking and biking tours in collaboration with the West Windsor Bicycle and Pedestrian Alliance. So stay tuned for that. So I strongly encourage all of you to follow us on Facebook and Instagram and take note of our website because we do routine updates on different history subjects, on different projects and events. We also have a monthly West Windsor Plans for Our News article in the very back of the newspaper. We publish that once a month. And finally, some just logistics to point out about this meeting. After I'm done speaking, I will hand it off to Reverend Norwood. And after his lecture, there will be a question and answer session. So feel free to ask questions during or after the lecture using the Zoom's built-in chat function, which is the little speech bubble icon found at the bottom of your screen. Now, Maggie Walsh, who is a fellow Historical Society member, and I will be asking your questions to Reverend Norwood to facilitate the conversation. And we apologize in advance, if we can't get to everyone's questions, but we hope there's a lot of enthusiasm. So once again, thank you to everyone for being here, and to whatever extent you can, please give Reverend Norwood a very warm welcome. And now, Reverend Norwood, again, thank you very much, and take it away.
Well, I want to thank you, Mr. Getty and Ms. Walsh for being so helpful and inviting. I'm going to share my screen at this time, and hopefully all the technology will work. We've all become far more expert than ever imagined through this time period. New opportunities have opened up to all of us in regard to using these technology that's available. So thank you again for having me. And I'm going to be talking about the indigenous people of Shaiti. And there are many people who live in New Jersey that don't have a clue as to what Shaiti is, but that's actually the indigenous name for the area called New Jersey now. It actually is a Lenape word that refers to being partially surrounded by water, by the water's edge, which New Jersey is. On one side, you've got the river. At the southernmost area, you have the bay, and then of course there's the ocean to the east. In presenting about the Nanticoke-Lenape, one of the things that I stress is that we are indeed still here. What was brought up a little earlier is that there are so many who are surprised that there are any indigenous people that still live in New Jersey whose indigeneity is actually from New Jersey, and they weren't indigenous people from other areas of North America that happened to move here. The two tribes that my tribe hails from are the Nanticoke and the Lenni-Lenape. The Lenni-Lenape, the original territory called Lenape-Hokie, or the land of the Lenape, is an area that occupied southeastern New York, southwestern Connecticut, all of New Jersey, and eastern Delaware along the Delaware River, which we call the Lenape-Wikituk, and northern Delaware around the area of the Delaware Bay, which we call Pawtucket. And that entire region is the traditional home of the Lenape. The Lenape are referred to as the grandfathers or ancient ones by many other tribes because we are viewed as the ancient root or the trunk of a tree of family of tribes. And I had an interesting experience many years ago when I was representing the tribe at the national level. A gentleman old enough to be my father came up to me and called me one of the ancient ones. We've had chiefs that have received special recognition when they've been in meetings with those tribes that refer to our tribe as the grandfathers or the ancient ones. At one point, we were head of a league of coastal tribal nations that were referred to as our grandchildren. The Nanticoke, also known as the Tidewater people, are among the tribes that actually came out from the Lenape many centuries ago. And there's several legends about how that happened, but all of them point to the fact that there were some Lenape who were simply looking for additional hunting areas to set up villages and moved for a little further south. And the Nanticoke actually occupied the central portion of the Delmarva Peninsula, and their entire territory actually kind of crossed into the southern border of the Lenape territory. And there are Nanticoke people still in that region, and the families are still intermarrying even today. The communities actually were connected by footpaths that formed some of the highways that you have today that were based on our ancient footpaths all over New Jersey. And we were not a tribe that followed buffalo along the plains. We were in the woodlands, and we tended to be pretty sedentary. We had a summer village and we had a winter village. In the summer, we were by the coasts. In the winter, we tended to have a permanent settlement by the streams in the interior of our territory. And we farmed in addition to hunting and gathering. Our families were matrilineal in nature. A man joined his wife's family, his wife's clan structure. Now, while there were other tribes that had a centralized kind of form of government, the Lenape have always been a little more loosely organized. Our people always acknowledged each other. We distinguished ourselves from other tribes, but each community had its own semi-autonomy. And we would gather together for regions of having councils, meetings, peace treaties, and we would name spokespersons on those occasions. Another thing that's interesting about our people, and that is not well understood, I've had to correct many museum displays, is that we were not polytheistic. We were always monotheistic. We always acknowledged a single creator. And even the early missionaries who came among us wound up identifying the fact that we were, and even though we acknowledge lesser spirits, we've always been monotheistic in regard to our understanding of our spiritual relationship to the Creator. The early contact resulted in some hostile situations. We actually had a hostile engagement with John Smith of Jamestown fame when he first came up one of the rivers in the Nanticoke territory. Our ancestors tried to kill him. And the reason was the last engagement that they had had with European style ships coming up the river. The Europeans had actually taken some of our people. I'm not exactly sure which country those ships were from, although there have been some that have suggested they were Spanish ships that actually came slightly before the British. But that had been the recent memory. And what initially was our hostile response to John Smith coming into the territory, he had learned how to leave gifts and then leave the area. And when he left gifts on the shoreline and then quickly departed, we realized that it was an act of peace, and we began trading instead with the Jamestown colony. And there are records that indicate that the Jamestown colony viewed us as tremendous traders. We also had engagements with the Dutch and the Swedes and the English. New Sweden was in South Jersey and northern Delaware. The Dutch colony of, I believe, New Netherland was up in New York, and actually their influence extended down further. We actually had hostile engagements with the Dutch as far down south as Cape Henlopen at the mouth of the Delaware Bay on the Delaware state side of the bay. From the time of first contact with Europeans, 90% of our people had been decimated by disease and other hostilities, and there were forgotten battles that took place, forgotten wars that took place during the early colonial era that aren't taught in the public schools today. It was said by one of our chiefs that for every European that got off of a ship, 9 of our people died. And while the colonists in the earlier days actually relied on our assistance in surviving in this new territory, there was a wave of influence and new settlement, and they brought with them the doctrine of discovery, which was based on certain papal bulls that had been adopted even by the non-Roman Catholic monarchs and governments that allowed them to claim the lands of non-Christians. And the language of those bulls said to vanquish and enslave any non-compliant inhabitants. And so there was a sense in which wherever a European flag was planted, they could claim that land. Now, not all of the Europeans dealt with us that way. We had a good relationship with the Quakers. In southern New Jersey, Fenwick's colony, established by John Fenwick, was one in which John Fenwick actually had treaty agreements with us as he set up his colony in southern New Jersey. And our people, especially around the tribal hub where many of the footpaths gathered, and there was a large village of our people around an area called Cohansik, which is modern day Bridgeton. We had in that area and in the areas of Salem County and modern day Cumberland County, treaties with the Quaker communities that were set up there. And those treaties are actually continuing to be honored today between the Quaker community and our tribe in South Jersey. Another famous treaty that many people may be familiar with is the Treaty of Shakomax, and also called the Penn Treaty, where Governor William Penn met with our council of chiefs, and the selected spokesperson was Chief Tamminen. And the agreement was made in accordance with our tradition of making covenants. And there was an exchange of wampum belts. Wampum are shell beads that are woven together to form these elaborate patterns in jewelry and especially in belts. And the belts would commemorate certain agreements, certain important events. And the exchange of belts that took place was significant because Governor Penn actually had a belt made so that he could honor our way of making a treaty. And the exchange of belts took place. The one that you see here is the more famous of the two, and it is the one that was presented to William Penn by Chief Tamminen. The goal initially, while Penn was here, at least his hope for the colony, was that the two communities would be able to live together in perpetual peace and be as though we were of one flesh and one blood. The promise of Tamminen was that our people would live with William Penn and his children as long as the creeks and the rivers run and while the sun, moon, and stars. endure. Unfortunately, as William Penn departed and went back to England years later as his son became governor, the treaty was broken with the walking purchase, where large swaths of Lenape territory were taken. Our people actually were hunted, and that's something that's not known and is not taught. In 1678, the Maryland colony, which included Delaware at the time, defined an enemy Indian as anyone who didn't call aloud when they were within 300 paces of an Englishman's cleared ground. And also anyone who came across an English person in the woods, and anyone who wore paint, any decoration on their face, which sometimes was merely ceremonial, and then did not immediately and voluntarily lay down their weapons at the sight of an English person. And anyone meeting this definition could be killed by a colonist, who would in turn receive 50 pounds for the scalp of a so-called enemy Indian. And there was no distinction made between men, women, children, or the elderly. Early on, we were placed on we were placed on reservations. There are many people that don't know that the reservations here in the United States did not start out west in the 1800s, even though those are the ones that you hear the most about and are depicted in Western movies. But the reservations actually began here in the East in the early colonial period. The people in the Delmarva Peninsula and in New Jersey were pressed onto reservations in the 1600s and 1700s. In New Jersey, we weren't forced on those reservations, but what happened in the Delmarva and other areas in the Northeast is that those reservations were set up so that we could supposedly live unaccosted. But because the tradition among our people was to move seasonally between the coast and the interior, if any of the lands were viewed not to be occupied for any amount of time, they were taken. And so the reservations really didn't hold up. We did have one here in New Jersey that was set up in the mid 1700s and then was disbanded in the early 1800s, and that was in Burlington County. It was called the Brotherton Reservation, and it too did not succeed. There were about 70 Lenape people that were living there by the time it was disbanded. And the Lenape in New Jersey were never forced to live there, and most that lived in New Jersey chose not to live there. Those that did not cluster on a reservation, the vast majority had been pushed further and further west by the 1740s. And there you have the notion that all of the Lenape left the area. And the thought is, when the Brotherton Reservation closed, the last of the Lenape left. Well, that's not accurate. I mean, the historical record shows that one of our treaties was actually signed allowing the Brotherton to leave, and in the treaty it made reference to the rest of us that chose to stay. And yet New Jersey history for many generations acted as though those remaining Lenape no longer existed. In addition, there were laws that actually changed the definition of what an Indian was, and therefore changed our racial classification. Now, I use the term Indian simply because that is the term that is used by many of our national organizations. Native American can be used actually for anyone who is born here in the United States, and Indigenous is a term that is perfectly acceptable, and the use of our tribal names is perfectly acceptable. But there are many tribes that use the term Indian simply because that is the term that is used in our treaties and in federal law. And so we have adopted it, even though technically it's not accurate. Now, what's interesting is in changing the definition, in 1740, the definition in Delaware changed to a non-Christian living in the woods and eating primarily deer meat. And then it was updated again to those living far away from the state. Now, obviously, this had nothing to do with a person's racial or ethnic cultural identity, but rather just simply their living pattern. So my ancestors, who became Christian in the early 1700s and began living in European-style dwellings and were eating European-style food, many of them were no longer considered to be indigenous. They were considered something else, because the understanding was that you couldn't be both an Indian and a Christian at the same time, and people would be reclassified as free persons of color or mulatto upon being baptized. This reclassification continued as census takers and others were actually changed what we said we were in census records as late as the 1920s. And we can see that there are individuals who identified by their tribal identity, and when the census taker took it back to the main office, that tribal identity is crossed out and a racial classification, a different one, is entered in. The concept was to kill the Indian and save the man. And from the 1880s to the 1960s, children were being taken from their families and put in Indian boarding schools. There are members of my own family that attended the Haskell Indian Institute out in Kansas in as late as the 1940s. What you see in the right-hand side of the screen, those little handcuffs were for children. And you can see just how small their little wrists would be. The graveyard that you see is at the Carlisle Indian Institute in Pennsylvania. It is now the War College for the United States military. And many people don't know that there are many Indian children whose remains are interred in that ground. They don't know the history of that school. The person that set up the Indian boarding school system actually was a Union colonel from the Civil War who modeled it after prisoner of war camps used for Confederate soldiers. People ask, are there Indians still in New Jersey, Indian tribes still in New Jersey? And people assume don't all live on reservations somewhere out west. Fact of the matter is that at least by the 2010 census, and I'm waiting for more updated information from the 2020 census, 78% of those identifying as American Indian or Alaskan Native don't live on reservations. They live outside of these areas. There's 70,000 who identified in 2010 as American Indian in New Jersey or of American Indian descent. And what a lot of people don't know is there are 3 state recognized tribes here in New Jersey with an estimated 6,000 member enrollment and even more individuals that are considered part of the extended tribal family, but may not be enrolled citizens. The various tribes in the region go from the north, the Ramapo-Lenape on the New York border. That is one of the state recognized tribes. The Sand Hill Indians are a community that's not state recognized, but they are recognized by the other state recognized tribes as a legitimate historic community. The Powhatan-Lenape Nation, which are Virginia Indians that came up into the area and intermarried with some of the remaining Lenape in the 1800s. The Nanticoke-Lenape are the southernmost tribe, is actually more related to the 2 tribes in Delaware, the Lenape Indian tribe of Delaware and the Nanticoke Indian tribe. These 3 tribes are so closely related that the surnames repeat. You know, I can't visit either of the communities without visiting a whole lot of cousins. The Nanticoke-Lenape are the original people of the Delaware Bay area, and we have continued in community from ancient times. We didn't return from anywhere. The people stayed in community. And in southern New Jersey, that community is located in Cumberland County and Salem County, just on the edge of the Delaware Bay. And the 2 other communities, the Lenape and the Nanticoke in Delaware, are on the other side of the bay. And our people would go back and forth. For many years, the marriages happened only among the tribal people. That only began changing in the 50s and the 60s. And the concept prior to that is if you married outside of the community, you needed to leave the community for fear that if there was too much understanding about the identity of the communities, we would be persecuted. You have to remember that up through this time, children were still being taken and put in boarding schools. And the last memory of a removal of some of our people being taken out west and taken to one of the reservations out west in Oklahoma was among the living memory of the tribe within my lifetime. I knew elders who talked about how they remembered the last wagons being taken out in the 1920s. They've passed on since then, but these are individuals who told the story firsthand, even though it's hard to find any records of it. The Nanticoke-Lenape are a well-documented continuous community of interrelated Nanticoke and Lenape families. Our elders maintained the identity of the community, continued to pass down the stories, continued to pass down the cultural traditions. Our ancestors are well documented as tribal people on muster rolls going as far back as the French and Indian War. I have 2 ancestors that are listed on muster rolls. Many of us have ancestors that are listed as American Indian from the Revolutionary War, identified in Seaman's papers and during the Civil War and other census records. Now, what we see is that in the 1800s, especially the latter 1800s, early 1900s, there was anthropological interest in the remaining Native communities that were in the East, and we began to be documented and studied by branches or affiliated organizations with the United States government. And our families wound up being listed and identified in these records from the late 1800s, and the most recent list done by the Bureau of Ethnological Studies from the Smithsonian Institute was as late as the late 1940s. Our communities continued to be governed through our churches, and there are when the breakup of the national tribal governance between our tribes, when there was a breakup as people were being pushed further west and some stayed, it was the Christian community that actually kept us together. We established our own churches, established our own schools, and for 400 years, Christianity was a part of our tribal tradition. And as we formed our own churches, the governance of the tribe was the governance of the church. And there are even articles from the latter 1800s to testify to this. And the 3 churches you see here are the 3 continuing congregations that are acknowledged both by the United Methodist Board of Global Ministries and by their respective states as historic tribal churches. The first 2 are in Delaware, and then the one at the bottom is the church that is acknowledged here in the state of New Jersey. That's the St. John's United Methodist Church of Fordville, New Jersey. Each was established by Nanticoke-Lenape people, and the tribal government was in those churches for many generations. In New Jersey, the tribal government actually did not separate from the church until the late 60s, early 1970s. Even though we had established the schools and those institutions and even social organizations for tribal people, the determination to continue to advocate for our people was something that tribal leaders continued to press for. And by the late 60s, early 70s, the tribal leadership came out of the tribal churches and began to advocate for themselves as a separate entity with a reorganized tribal council and elected tribal chiefs. Our community is alive and well. Our culture is not stuck in the past. We sing many of the songs and dances of our ancestors, and we also have embraced the powwow style pan-Indian songs and dances that cross over tribal cultures. And you can go to another tribal powwow somewhere else in the country and be familiar with some of the styles of dance and be able to join in and even compete in these powwows, which are celebrations of culture, where there is dancing and the sharing of food and the sharing of stories. And quite often they are open to the public. And it's a place where Indigenous people from different tribes across the country and actually all of North America do come together and share their culture one with another. All of the photos you see here are photos of Nanticoke-Lenape people from New Jersey. Our elders to our youth continue to keep our circle unbroken. We have a tradition of honoring and caring for our elders, and they have great influence over the direction our tribe will take. Our elders have their council, and they advise our tribal government. Oftentimes, when decisions are being made, we check with the elders to make sure we're staying within the bounds of tradition. If they are displeased, they make their displeasure known. And we pass these traditions on to our children, our youth. The young ladies here are each representing our tribe at a national organization for Indian youth called Unity. And each of them have served as tribal representatives to that organization. Something that is not well known is that our tribe has a continuing relationship with the nation of Sweden because of the treaties that we have with that nation from the time when there was the New Sweden colony around the Delaware Bay. And what you see here is actually our current chief shaking the hand of the King of Sweden. And whenever the royal family comes to visit, they actually do spend time with our chiefs. Usually there is some ceremony that is taking place. If there is a social event for the people of Sweden, our leadership is often invited. And my own children participated in the opening of the Swedish embassy in Washington, D.C. Back about 10 or 15 years ago when their new embassy was opened there. There is a uniqueness to being Indigenous. Unlike other racial groups in the United States, non-Indigenous groups, their cultural heritage exists somewhere else, and it will continue regardless of whether it is suppressed or modified in this country, whereas American Indian tribes, our cultures really only exist here, and suppression could lead to total cultural extinction. For non-Indigenous groups, your self-identification is simply accepted. But for American Indians, identity must be proven, and the status has to be acknowledged by non-Native authorities. To simply say that you are Indigenous has no bearing, and many people will ask you what tribe and prove it. And that is not only insulting, but it is really the reality. And for non-Indigenous groups, with the exceptions of the victims of American slavery, you have a choice to be a part of the melting pot. Whereas for American Indians to do so, it would cause cultural destruction. And sadly, that actually was a part of American federal policy for many generations of our people. The concept of tribal sovereignty is extremely important. It's a cherished right. It is the right of American Indian tribes to govern themselves, determine their own future, determine the makeup of their tribe, the qualifications for citizenship, to administer justice and enforce laws. All of that continues among our people. And our tribal sovereignty was never surrendered. Matter of fact, federal law acknowledges that when a tribe becomes recognized, it is not a sovereignty that is given to the tribe. Rather, it is an acknowledgement of the sovereignty that that tribe has already had. That tribes pre-exist, they predate the sovereignty of the United States itself. Some of the stereotypes that we strive to overcome is, one, we don't all look alike, and we don't all look like the Hollywood stereotype, especially in the East, where there was mixing and blending with people from other parts of the world. Many, if not most, American Indians that are people of first contact along the coastal areas that had colonial contact, there is a level of admixture within the tribes. And even prior to contact, not all of our people looked like the Hollywood stereotype. There was variance based on where you were in the country. The Alaskan natives and those in the Northeast didn't look like those in the Southwest or those in the Northeast. There was always a difference. Most of us don't live on reservations, which is what I said before. Matter of fact, most American Indians live off reservation, out with the general public. And we are citizens both of the United States and of our tribes, and of course of the state we live in. One of the heavy stereotypes that we constantly have to struggle against is the concept that all American Indian tribes want or have casinos, and that's not true. Of the tribes that are eligible to have casinos under the Indian Gaming Act, not the majority don't. And there are many that don't want them. Our tribe actually has a law not to profit from any form of vice, which prevents us from participating in casino gambling. Our traditional dress is not called a costume, it's called regalia. A costume is something that you wear to portray something that you actually are not, something that you're pretending to be. Regalia is an expression of who you actually are. And our regalia is important because there are many items that we would wear that are of a spiritual nature, of a sacred nature, are individual, sometimes there are elements that you have to earn. So often when we see people just putting on Indian costume and thinking that somehow they're respecting us, they're actually insulting us. Our culture isn't stuck in the past. It is ever evolving. It changes. We honor the past. We try to make sure that we remember the things that have been handed down, but we are not constrained to merely do those things, and that we grow and change and our culture increases as it comes in contact with other peoples and traditions, just like every other culture. The other thing is that not all American Indian cultures are the same. When people say Native Americans all believe, or Native Americans do this or that, that sends up a yellow flag, sometimes a red flag in my mind, because the cultures are very different based on where you are. In the Northeast, there's a lot of similarities, but there are differences based on which tribal community and sometimes even which clan you may be from. And that the changes become even greater as you move to other areas of the country. Part of the reason that there's so much ignorance about American Indian history and culture is because the 27 states in our nation make no mention at all of a single Native American in the K through 12 curriculum. And 87% of state level history standards fail to cover anything about Native history after 1900. Many times in speaking with people who graduated from New Jersey schools and teachers that are still involved in New Jersey schools, one of the complaints is that in the history books, they get maybe a page or two dealing with the Lenape. And it basically says we were here and then we gave up the land and moved away. So it's not accurate or detailed at all. This ignorance, this void, winds up allowing people to think that the sports mascots are okay, that it's a way of honoring us. The portrayals of our women tend to be over-sexualized. There are offensive Halloween costumes and myths about our people, all kinds of inaccurate portrayals because of this vacuum of accurate information that persists here in America today. Something that can be done about it, and this is these slides I've borrowed from illuminatives.org and encourage you to visit the site. What we can do is to make sure that people educate themselves. Sadly, you have to educate yourself because it's not a part of the mandated curriculum as it should be. And when you find things out, share it with other people. Whatever you may have learned this evening, share it with others. Speak about it. Help to correct inaccuracies when you hear about it. Also, think about the way that you may speak about Native communities. If you always talk about us in the past tense, like we don't exist here anymore. Seek out the stories that amplify our voices. Make sure that when we are being discussed or talked about, if there's a way to hear our particular perspective, reach out and try to get it. We are working hard to not be invisible, but it's a battle that is continuing. It's a battle that is ongoing. And we're working hard to get rid of the stereotypes and to provide an accurate understanding of history. And certainly we need allies of good conscience who are willing to share in that effort. One of the things that a lot of people aren't aware of is that in 2007, the United Nations passed the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it covers 46 issues that are important to Native people. And of the 143 nations that voted for the declaration, there were only a handful of nations that actually opposed it and refused to sign on for quite some time. And sadly, the United States was one of them. And it wasn't until 2010 that the United States did sign on to the declaration, but they did so with a qualification, making it an aspirational document and thinking that it only applies to federally recognized tribes when that is not the case. And that's an ongoing battle between those who are on the Bureau of Indian Affairs list to receive certain protections and benefits as kind of ward governments of the federal government, those that are acknowledged by state governments, which have a certain level of acknowledgement because of that at the federal level, and those that don't have any acknowledgement at all because they don't have the federal or the state acknowledgement, and therefore don't have anything that falls under the protections that are supposed to be offered them. The various levels of acknowledgement sadly wind up being accidents of history for the most part. And there are many historically verifiable tribes that for generations were unnoticed because they didn't live on lands that the government wanted, so they were left alone and forgotten. They were overlooked and ignored. They didn't make war, so there was no reason to have a treaty, and then they became invisible. For more information, I encourage you to visit some of these sites, the First Light Mission, the Confederation online museum for our people, the Nanticoke-Lenape tribal website, and the New Jersey Commission on American Indian Affairs, which includes 2 voting members from each of the recognized communities within our state. And I thank you for your attention. I'd like to continue the discussion to give you some time to ask any questions at this point.
Hey, wonderful. Thank you again. And actually, before we get into the questions, you had mentioned the Carlisle School, which touched upon something that relates to West Windsor history, because we actually have an image related to that I'd like to share. So just give me 1 second. Need to pull it up on my computer. Okay. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So can you see my cursor, more importantly? And if not, I can animate
Yes.
it. Here we go. So I just like to circle this figure. This person, this man, a man was a man named William Owl, who actually we found out recently from the Lawrence Historical Society. For context, Lawrence is a town right next door to us. This is actually a picture taken around 1905 of what was called the Clarksville Schoolhouse. For West Windsor residents, you'll recognize the location. It was located at the intersection of Clarksville and Quaker Ridge Roads at the border of West Windsor Township and Lawrence Township. And this schoolhouse burned down in 1937, but had existed since the mid-1800s. And the reason I'm circling this man is because this is a man named William Owl, who we know as as a Sioux, a resident of the Sioux Nation, who was also part of the Carlisle school system in the late 1800s. And he was actually sent to West Windsor in the very early 1900s to work on the farm of a family. The last name was West, W-E-S-T. So, even stories such as the, forced assimilation and Carlisle school being a representative of that are not distant. They're not, just part of, Pennsylvania history or Midwest history. It's also part of West Windsor history as well. So, I was very, it was very interesting to hear you, Reverend Norwood, actually mention that, because that is a point I wanted to touch on now that you said it. So now we actually have a few questions that were sent via a variety of different ways. So I'm going to start with the first one, and you had mentioned that there were some recognized tribes. Are there federally and state recognized tribes? Are there communities that are still petitioning to become recognized, either in New Jersey or the surrounding areas?
Yes. I know that, for example, the Sandhill community wants to be state recognized. And I know that the tribes that are recognized in the state support them, because we've known them for generations, and we know that that's a legitimate community. A very small community now. There are not many Sandhills left. They are actually they are Cherokee Indians that moved into the area, intermarrying with some of the remnant Lenape. I believe in the late 1800s, and they're well documented. I know that my tribe and the related tribes in Delaware are still interested in federal recognition. What people don't understand is that for up through about 1934, recognition essentially meant that you were under the wardship of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and prior to that, the Department of War, and that your tribe was. And in 1934, the Indian Reorganization Act kind of standardized those that fell under that heading and gave them what was called federal recognition, and made them kind of wards under the United States government, had them write constitutions that caused any change to their law to have to be approved by the Secretary of the Interior, which was robbing them of their inherent sovereignty. A very serious issue. Those that fought for recognition after that, during a time period in the late 40s and early 50s called the termination period, where the federal government actually was trying to end federal recognition to destroy the tribes and force assimilation again. Many tribes that had been recognized lost their recognition. State recognition actually is older. It goes back to the form of it goes back to the colonial era. The state recognized tribes, many of them have colonial era reservations that they continue to live on. There are tribes that became state recognized here in New Jersey in the 1980s, but it's because they could show that they had been here and were known to have been here prior to 1900. And so the three recognized tribes here in New Jersey, the state recognized tribes have that. And our tribe is interested in federal acknowledgement, but the process takes generations. The Shinnecock that were acknowledged up in New York, they spent over $20 million going through that process, had to go through the federal court system to force the Bureau of Indian Affairs to make a final decision. It's a very difficult challenge. The system was set up to help tribes that had the history to be recognized back in 1978 or so. And the first few tribes that went through with a few notebooks of information. Now, the tribes that go through the system have tens of thousands of pages of documents and have had to pay professional historians and a team of lawyers. And many that have to do that wind up getting their money from casino investors, which is why people see that link between the two, but it doesn't have to be that way. And tribes that don't want to profit from vice fall into the situation of my own tribe without those resources.
Thank you for that. And thank you in general for the presentation. I learned a lot. You mentioned that there was a treaty with the Quakers that still exists today. Can you go into that a little bit more? What was that treaty?
Yes. Well, there were several land grants that took place in, I guess technically it was Salem County at the time, in the late 1600s with Fenwick's colony. Those land grants are actually spelled out online for different areas, and the protection of the tribal communities was set up by the Quakers in South Jersey, where we lived in what were called Indian fields, which were little Indian towns where our people continued to live in their old way. And what eventually happened was that, and my chief bore witness to this, and then the documents showed up that like shocked me how this happened. But it was at a time when our own people weren't able to have deeded land. The land that was ours, we couldn't have deeded back to us. And the Quakers bought land for us. And the people in southern New Jersey wound up able to get that land, and eventually as time passed, having the deeds turned over. And those families stayed in the area of Indian fields. And where the families are was on a map dated to around 1902. And those families are still on those lands today in southern New Jersey. Down in Delaware, there were similar situations, although it wasn't with the Quakers, where the people that stayed had adapted to certain European ways and got deeded land and adopted certain life ways, and that's why they were able to stay. For many years, the powwow among the Nanticoke in southern Delaware was on Norwood land. It was the land some of my cousins maintained from those ancient times.
That's really, I mean, it's really interesting to hear about that, continuity. Now, another question that we got was, you had talked about the, communication between tribes within New Jersey. Is there active communication or coordination with, the tribes who went out to the Midwest?
Cyclically, yes. And with individuals, yes. The tribal governments, sadly, that are in Oklahoma have a love-hate relationship with us. For many years, their individuals accepted us, their elders accepted us, came to visit with us, and the issues of competition and fear that seem to be part of the system of federal acknowledgement and trying to have one up on the other tribes and to be the only ones has caused some tension for the tribal governments out there. When the Delaware tribe in Bartlesville lost their federal recognition in the 1990s, they had a wonderful relationship with us prior to that. It's documented that they acknowledged us, that they visited with us. I had the opportunity to visit with them and was invited to sit at their drum, which is a particular honor to participate in those ancient drumming ceremonies and dances. And we were actually introduced to dance with them when they made a national presentation at the National Congress of American Indians in the early 2000s. When they got their federal acknowledgement restored, they unliked us again. So there is, and that's not every individual, and it's not everyone in leadership, but there is this exclusivity club, a type of apartheid that has been pressed down upon Indian country, where it has many who are federally acknowledged thinking that that is the demarcation of legitimacy, without realizing that that is a colonized standard. So we have a relationship, we have friends, we have individuals that are welcoming. We have fought for them on many occasions. We have a better relationship with those that are up in Wisconsin, and we have a tremendous relationship with those that are in Canada. Matter of fact, the Canadians, without the pressures and the divisions that are placed within the American system, the Canadians actually remember the old stories that refer to us as the keepers of the land, those that stayed in the homeland. And in the late 1990s, there were Canadians that sent a delegation down from what they call preserves up in Canada. A couple of the preserves, Lenape preserves, came and visited us on our tribal land in the homeland. And it was a very emotional time. I mean, just full of tears. To this day, they still come in fellowship with us and hold ceremonies with us in southern New Jersey. When I had the opportunity to visit the Moravian Town Reservation of Lenape people up in Ontario, we were well received as their relatives. So sadly, politics has caused some distance for some members in the Lenape diaspora.
Thank you for that. You mentioned that some of the powwows are open to the community. Are there opportunities for maybe people who aren't members of a tribe to come and experience cultural events like that?
Oh, we hope you do.
Oh, nice.
You know, for the last couple of years, sadly, our powwow had to be canceled because of COVID. We're hoping to have it again this year. It will be on the second weekend of June at the Salem County Fairgrounds, and that's typically when and where it is. Second weekend of June at the fairgrounds. The links that are at the end of the presentation, I'll email to Mr. Maggette, and you know, you can post them, share them, however. And the one to the tribe will give all the information and any necessary updates due to health issues. You know, we don't know what's going to happen with COVID. It's been very unpredictable. But I know that also the Ramapo have one. I believe theirs is in September. The Nanticoke, our cousins in Delaware, they have a very large powwow in September, right the weekend after Memorial Day. No, I'm sorry, the weekend after Labor Day in September. And the powwows are usually a few days long. And all of the ones I just listed are open to the public. There are non-tribal powwows that are hosted by organizations in the area that tribal people will come and participate in. I don't recall which ones off the top of my head, but there are quite a few of them also.
I mean, that's great to hear. And yeah, if when you send me the links, we'll absolutely send that out to everyone. It's really interesting to hear.
Another interesting point, a lot of people think that powwow is something that started out west and came east. Actually, in the 20th century, it came east, but it actually originated here in the east. It's actually based on a northeastern Algonquian language word related to Lenape. And the oldest continuous powwow in the country is the Narragansett in Rhode Island. And they're like 360 some straight years they have had theirs, and it's been open to the public.
Again, very, very interesting. Now, how do you encourage younger tribal members to stay involved?
Well, that's often done within families. If you have a family that is active, they will encourage their children to be active. There are many young people who, because they want to be able to affirm their heritage, having some level of activity within the tribe is very important to them. There is a youth council called New Dawn for the older youth, and there is a little children's group called the Acorns for the little ones, and we try to make sure that the children are connected that way. And there's also still a very strong continuing relationship with the tribal churches. Even though the governments no longer are in the church is still part of the tribe. And while it's open to anyone to come and worship and to join the congregation, the connection to the tribe is still very, very close.
Another question we got was whether the language survives. I know that some tribes have like a revitalization efforts and things like that. Is there anything going on in terms of language with your community?
Yes. The Lenape dialect that our people speak is Unami, and it is being revived among our people. For many years, it was banned. It was illegal to speak, and people were afraid to speak their language, and so it was lost. But fortunately, the Unami dialect has been well preserved, and it's being revived. Those that went out west in Oklahoma actually had living speakers of Lenape as late as the 80s and early 90s. And matter of fact, some of them visited our community. So there is a language revitalization project. Our younger people speak it much better than those of us with gray hair, but we're all still, embracing it and learning it. Nanticoke was not as well preserved, unfortunately, by various academics. But interestingly enough, there's maybe about 1,000 words that are preserved in a vocabulary that was actually ordered by Thomas Jefferson when he was president. And we have those words that were original. And because Lenape is the root language, the grammar is very similar. And there's an effort among the Nanticoke in Delaware to revive the Nanticoke language also.
That's great.
Yeah, I mean, it's really good to hear. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's also like an online talking dictionary that had been developed over the course of decades.
Yes.
Do you know which of the language groups that was?
Unami. That's Unami. It's called the Talk Lenape Dictionary, yep. And it was sponsored with a grant to the Delaware tribe in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. Very, very good tool. It originated on CD discs. Matter of fact, prior to that, it was on tape. The little cassette tapes went to CDs, and now with the technology, it's on the internet. Mm-hmm. And there you can hear some of the Lenape elders that have passed on now. You can hear them speaking the language, so you can get the proper pronunciation. which I tend to slay. I still work on it, but you know, I'm still learning English. So
Now you had mentioned the Unami. Now, are there, okay, so based on the sources in my own personal research, I've either seen there being 2 language groups or 3 historically. The Unami, Munsee, and maybe the Unalachtigo. Were there 2 or were there 3? Because I see conflicting sources.
it depends on what period of history you're speaking of, and that's where the confusion comes in. Languages evolve and change. Some die, others merge. So it depends on the time period. There are 2 main language groups within Lenape. There is Munsee, which is in the north, and there's Unami, which is in the south. There was a version of Unami called Northern Unami that kind of was spoken through to the late 1800s. Actually was the root for what we call Mission Lenape that was spoken in some of the missionary communities that were pushed further and further west and further north, and the Northern Unami was kind of a blend more or less between Munsee, some Munsee sounding words and some Southern Unami sounding words. And then further south was Unalachtigo, which, there's a debate as to whether that was really a separate dialect or was just a subset of Southern Unami. We don't have a lot of information on Unalachtigo. I've heard that it may be closely related to Nanticoke, but unfortunately there's not a lot preserved, so I really can't speak with any level of authority about it. But I know that by the 1800s, you had, by the mid to late 1800s, you had Munsee and you had Unami, which was Southern Unami. Now, Nanticoke was spoken straight through to the mid 1800s. Matter of fact, one of the last born Nanticoke speakers on record was one of my great aunts, Lydia Norwood Clark in Delaware. But it was dying out at that time also.
Another question from the chat. You showed a picture of a Wampum Belt, and the question is, does that belt still exist? Is that still around somewhere, preserved?
Yes. For many years, it was in, oh my goodness, there was a museum in Philadelphia, the name of which escapes me right now for some reason, that wound up closing. They had preserved it for many years, and the last I understood it was at Drexel. And there was Drexel or the University of Pennsylvania. It's in Philadelphia, one of the schools in Philly. And there was a debate about whether it should be there or whether it should go out to the Bartlesville community in Oklahoma, because they have preservation there. And we actually supported that idea because we thought it should be among Lenape people, and because they had the resources that they should be preserving it. That argument was prior to COVID, and I don't know if, what happened to it. COVID kind of messed everything up. So I can't give an accurate picture of where it is right now. There are quite a few replicas that are around that are made by Indigenous people. I actually made one that you can see. It is an accurate replica right down to the number of beads. Wow. And what appeared to be errors, but actually were symbols. And that's at the Faith and Liberty Center in Philadelphia on the Constitution Mall.
Wow.
Great. Well, the next question I guess would be, you had mentioned that the federal process had just become so much more difficult over the years. What are some of the main reasons for that?
Because there was no standard to keep it transparent. And it seemed as though once a tribe got through and made it, the rules changed so that the strengths of their petition no longer wound up applying. For example, the first few tribes that went through were able to rely on certain types of records from certain archaeologists and anthropologists, Once they got through, suddenly the federal government said, well, we're not accepting those types of records anymore for proof. So the goalposts continue to change, and what worked for one tribe, the same argument wasn't working for another. The reviews were inconsistent in regard to the decisions that were being made. And there was a major change that took place in 2015, trying to hold the Office of Federal Acknowledgement to task on consistency and the fact that what you said worked in one case has to also work in another. We're still waiting to see how that is shaking out, because sadly, no tribes have gotten through since then. Congress actually has the right to recognize tribes. The recognition for the Bureau of Indian Affairs under the Department of Interior is a delegated right by Congress. And our tribe has petitioned Congress because we believe that we were erroneously left off the list in 1934, and have some documents to show that we should have been on the list in 1934. The problem was invisibility, but the federal government, even though we were not receiving direct services from them in 1934, they were very much aware of who we were, and we have found lists where they've identified the citizens of our tribe. Our tribal families are listed by name prior to 1934. So why we were left off the list, we don't know. We were good enough to take our children to Indian schools.
I mean, is that the case with, sorry, Maggie, but is that the case with the other two state recognized tribes in New Jersey, that they, you know?
I'm unfamiliar with the level of documentation that each of them has. You know, it's interesting because you're penalized because you didn't document things at a time when it was dangerous to be identified as being a tribal community. So you don't keep heavy records if you are hiding in plain sight, and everything you do is within the community and kind of hidden. I would assume that that's very similar for the Ramapo. I don't know the situation for the Powhatan Lenape community. I do know that they arrived in the late 1800s. I know that they are Virginia Indians. Some of them are also from Delaware. Some of them have Nanticoke roots, and I know that because they're family. Quite a few. I know that when they intermarried, because we know their family stories, at least from when they got to New Jersey in the late 1800s. Which is important to say. There are no new tribes. There are old tribes that may not be known, but there are no new tribes. These communities have been around and have been known by other Native communities in their immediate area. We've interacted for generations, in many cases intermarried. The community in southern New Jersey, the Nanticoke-Lenape, that was a way station for natives coming from New England and New York. When they came down and wanted to go to the Jersey Shore, and they were too brown to stay in some of the hotels, and they were worried about their safety, they would come to our community and stay with our families. And some of those surnames of ours wound up there, and some of their surnames wound up down with us because of it. But all of that was happening around the turn of the last century.
Wow. Another question we got was, are there still reservations in New Jersey? I know you mentioned one that is no longer exists. And if they are still in New Jersey, how big are they and where are they?
There are no federal reservations in New Jersey. There are no state reservations in New Jersey since the closing of the Brotherton Reservation. What you do have are the continuation of what had been Indian towns, which were unofficial reservations. They were not established by a government. They were established by the communities. And I know that the Ramapo would probably be considered that their people lived up on their mountain back during colonial days. And it was known that they were up there. And our folks were, the colonial era maps actually, when you look at southern New Jersey, where they have the little wigwam symbol showing where our people were, and they have Cohanzic, which are Cohanzic or Cohansey, That's the tribe in southern New Jersey. That's the Nanticoke-Lenape. That community is still right there today, living in the community that was considered an Indian field or Indian town back in the colonial era. But there are no reservations. On the Delmarva Peninsula, there were quite a few reservations. Where my father's side of the family came from, and they no longer exist. Although the people still live there. The community in southern Delaware, the community in central Delaware. That's where those old reservations or an Indian town was.
Thank you again for that. And again, I want to reiterate that it's just very interesting seeing this, this continuity. Tying back in obviously to the lecture title, we are still here. Now I think you've answered pretty much all of the questions in the chat except for one final one, which is, and I'll tack on a little bit to this. Is there a museum or another source that you could recommend that portrays the history of Indigenous people in New Jersey?
Yeah, there is online. The link is the story of the Nanticoke-Lenape peoples at the Nanticoke-Lenape museum.org. We actually were in the process of putting together our brick and mortar museum on our tribal land in Fairton, New Jersey. Prior to COVID, the walls are up and the displays are in storage, but we weren't able to finish it. We're hoping that we'll be able to finish it now that it looks like maybe things are lightening up in regard to COVID, prayerfully. So I'm hoping that within the next year or so, that's a place that you'll be able to come and visit. The State Museum actually had a room and had on occasion certain displays that depict the history of Indigenous people in this area. So those are a few places in New Jersey. The Nanticoke tribe in Sussex County in Millsboro have a standing museum that actually was one of the tribal schools.
Great. I had no clue that that you were setting up a museum. I really want to visit when it's opening up.
That actually
Yes, so do I.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it myself.
That actually made me think of another question. Are there any other projects or events that you're working on right now that you want to share?
Well, just the upcoming powwow and on the second weekend of June. And if you go to the tribal website, they have done a lot of work using video and everything and YouTube, trying to post things online, because the outreach that we typically were able to do, we weren't able to do for the past 2 years. So there's more online now than ever before that I would invite you to check out. And, if you're interested, I actually have, I was asked not too long ago to put together a list of the links to some of the things that I've done online. And I could send that to you also. If I don't, remind me. I don't have a great memory these days.
That's I'll follow up after this with that and the events. But either way, again, thank you very much for being here. Now I've actually enabled everyone if they want to unmute and say thank you. If not, that's fine. But either way, at the very least, I want to say thank you, because I know we've been going back and forth on this for a few months now, and it finally happened. And I learned actually quite a lot more than I was expecting. And it was just wonderful to have you here. So thanks again.
It was an honor, and I truly appreciate the invitation and the hospitality, and certainly want to invite everybody to come and visit our people, especially for our powwow. We say Wanishi for thank you, and we don't have a word for goodbye, but we say La Peach Kenewo, which means I will see you again.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Once again. Okay. Everyone have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.
God bless.
Thanks. Bye.